Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are pulling back the curtain on stories that powerful people would rather you didn't connect. From Hong Kong's billion-dollar university megaprojects to the Clintons finally facing questions about Jeffrey Epstein, from Singapore's suspicious budget math to scientific breakthroughs that raise uncomfortable questions about who gets access to life-changing research.
I'm Maya Clarity, and let me tell you, when we laid these stories side by side in the newsroom today, the pattern that emerged was striking. Tonight we're following the money, following the power, and following the science. We've got government-backed bonds funding massive campus developments, former presidents under oath, a city-state sitting on billions more than it predicted, and new research that could reshape how we think about aging. Stay with us, because by the end of this broadcast, you'll see how all of these threads weave together.
Let's not waste any time. We're starting tonight in Hong Kong, where authorities have just signaled they're open to something unprecedented, backing universities to issue bonds, essentially debt instruments, to fund what they're calling the university town in the northern metropolis. This is not a small renovation project, folks. This is a mega project, and the word mega is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
That's right, Alex. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, Hong Kong's Financial Secretary Paul Chan Mopa told the Legislative Council's Finance Committee that the government would consider supporting what's being called a tertiary education bond. Lawmakers are now pushing for a dedicated approval mechanism and even a credit rating system specifically for these university-issued bonds. Let that sink in. We're talking about creating an entirely new financial architecture around higher education debt.
And here's where my investigative instincts start firing. When a government says it's open to backing bond issuances, what that really means is taxpayers are being positioned as the ultimate guarantors of this debt. If these bonds go south, if enrollment projections don't materialize, if construction costs balloon, and when do mega construction projects ever come in on budget, it's the public that holds the bag. The universities get their gleaming new campuses, the construction firms get their contracts, and ordinary Hong Kong residents get the risk.
The Northern Metropolis project itself is worth examining. This is Hong Kong's massive development plan near the border with mainland China, and the university town is a flagship component. We're talking about relocating or expanding campuses for multiple universities into a purpose-built academic zone. The scale is enormous. And the financing question has been the elephant in the room since this project was first announced. Traditional government funding wasn't going to cover it, so now we see the creative financial engineering begin.
Let's talk about who actually benefits from this arrangement. First, the construction and real estate development sector, and in Hong Kong, that is an extraordinarily powerful lobby. Second, the universities themselves gain massive new physical infrastructure that enhances their global rankings and prestige. Third, Beijing gets deeper institutional integration between Hong Kong's academic sector and the mainland through geographic proximity. And fourth, the financial sector gets a whole new class of bond products to package, rate, and trade.
And who loses? Potentially the students, who may face higher tuition to service this debt. Potentially the taxpayers, if these bonds require government guarantees or backstops. And potentially academic freedom itself, because when your campus is funded by government-backed bonds tied to a politically significant mega-project, the pressure to stay in political lockstep becomes even more intense. This is Hong Kong we're talking about, where the space for institutional independence has been shrinking year after year.
What really concerns me is the call for a dedicated credit rating mechanism. In mature bond markets, credit ratings are supposed to be independent assessments of default risk. But when lawmakers are calling for a special, dedicated system, that sounds less like independent assessment and more like a mechanism designed to ensure these bonds get favorable ratings regardless of their actual risk profile. It's the kind of financial architecture that looks solid on paper until it doesn't.
And let's connect this to the broader trend we've been tracking on this show. Governments around the world are increasingly using complex financial instruments to move public spending off the balance sheet. Instead of directly funding projects through taxation and transparent budgeting, they create these quasi-public, quasi-private financing structures that obscure who bears the real risk. It happened with infrastructure bonds, it happened with public-private partnerships, and now it's coming for higher education in Hong Kong.
The final question every taxpayer in Hong Kong should be asking is simple: if these university projects are genuinely good investments, why do they need government backing for their bonds? If the market believed in the financial viability of University Town, these bonds would sell themselves. The fact that government support is being discussed suggests that without it, the market wouldn't touch this debt at the proposed terms. That tells you everything you need to know about where the real risk lies.
Now let's shift to what may be the most consequential story of the night, and one that has been decades in the making. Alex, the Clintons are about to face questions about their connections to Jeffrey Epstein.
This is a story we at Truth Report have been tracking relentlessly. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, both former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton are set to testify about their links to Jeffrey Epstein. Let me be clear about what we know. Bill Clinton's connections to Epstein have been documented for years. Flight logs showed Clinton flew on Epstein's private jet, dubbed the Lolita Express, multiple times. Clinton has acknowledged knowing Epstein but has consistently denied knowledge of or participation in any criminal activity.
What makes this moment different from all the previous rounds of speculation and reporting is that this is testimony. This is on the record, under oath. For years, the Epstein case has been defined by what powerful people refused to say. Witnesses went silent. Documents were sealed. Investigations were shut down or slow-walked. The fact that both Clintons are now being questioned represents a shift in the willingness of legal and political systems to actually follow this trail wherever it leads, or at least, that's what we're being asked to believe.
And let me be the investigative journalist here and ask the uncomfortable question, what took so long? Jeffrey Epstein was first investigated in the mid-2000s. He received that infamous sweetheart plea deal in 2008, brokered by Alexander Acosta, who later became a cabinet secretary. Epstein was arrested again in 2019 and died in federal custody under circumstances that remain deeply suspicious to millions of people. We are now in 2026, and we're only just getting to the point where one of the most prominent names connected to Epstein is testifying.
The question everyone should be asking is not just what the Clintons will say, but what framework of accountability actually exists here. Testimony is not the same as prosecution. Being questioned is not the same as being held accountable. We've seen this pattern before in the Epstein saga, the appearance of investigation without the substance of justice. Every time the public's attention flares up, there's a procedural step that looks like progress but doesn't actually result in consequences for anyone at the top of the power structure.
What we know about the Epstein network is that it functioned as an influence operation as much as anything else. Epstein cultivated relationships with the most powerful people in politics, finance, science, and academia. He used his wealth and connections to create a web of complicity and obligation. The question has never really been whether powerful people knew Epstein. Of course they did, that was the entire point. The question is what they knew about his criminal activities and whether they participated in, enabled, or covered up those activities.
And here's where I want to bring some analytical precision. When we talk about the Clintons being questioned, we need to understand the legal and political context. This testimony is happening against the backdrop of years of partisan weaponization of the Epstein case. Both sides of the political aisle have figures connected to Epstein, and both sides have attempted to use those connections as political ammunition while deflecting from their own exposure. The Clintons are prominent targets, but they are far from the only powerful people who should be answering questions.
Exactly right, Maya. And that's why we at Truth Report refuse to make this a partisan story. The Epstein case implicates people across the political spectrum, across industries, across national borders. Any honest investigation has to follow every thread, not just the politically convenient ones. If you're only interested in the Epstein connections of people you already oppose politically, you're not interested in justice, you're interested in leverage. And that's exactly how Epstein himself operated.
What I'll be watching for in this testimony is not just the answers but the questions that don't get asked. History has shown us that when powerful people testify about the Epstein network, the questioning often stays safely within boundaries that don't threaten the broader power structure. The real story isn't any single person's testimony, it's whether the system is finally willing to confront the full scope of what Epstein's network represented, which was the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people, enabled and protected by wealth and institutional power.
And one more thing before we move on, the victims. In all the political drama around who knew what and who flew where, we must never lose sight of the fact that real people, many of them minors at the time, were trafficked, abused, and traumatized. They have been waiting for justice for decades. Every delay, every procedural maneuver, every sealed document represents a further betrayal of those survivors. That's what this story is really about.
Absolutely. Now let's cross over to Southeast Asia, where Singapore's government is dealing with an embarrassing math problem, or a suspiciously convenient one, depending on your perspective. Alex, Singapore just revealed a budget surplus that was more than double what was projected.
More than double, Maya. According to the South China Morning Post's reporting, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong revealed in his budget statement that Singapore expects a surplus of 15.1 billion Singapore dollars, that's roughly $12 billion US dollars, for the 2025 financial year. That represents 1.9% of gross domestic product, and it is dramatically larger than what the government's own forecasts predicted. Members of Parliament are now openly questioning the accuracy of these budget forecasts, and the term being used is poor fiscal marksmanship.
Now, the Prime Minister's defense is interesting. Wong is framing this massive surplus as the result of quote, tough decisions to raise taxes earlier, positioning it as a sign of strength. He's essentially saying, we overtaxed you, but that's a good thing because now we have a cushion. And from a strict fiscal management perspective, there's an argument there. But from a democratic accountability perspective, this is deeply problematic.
Here's why. A budget is not just an accounting document. It's a social contract. When a government tells its citizens, we need this much revenue to fund these services, and then collects billions more than it said it needed, that represents a fundamental breakdown in fiscal transparency. Either the government genuinely couldn't predict its own revenue and spending with reasonable accuracy, which suggests incompetence, or it deliberately lowballed its surplus projections, which suggests manipulation.
And in Singapore's case, the implications are especially significant because of how the country's political system works. Singapore operates as a parliamentary system dominated by the People's Action Party, which has held power since independence. The budget process is one of the few moments where the government's fiscal decisions face public scrutiny. If the numbers presented during that process are consistently and dramatically wrong, it undermines one of the limited accountability mechanisms that exists.
Let's look at where that surplus money sits. In Singapore's system, budget surpluses flow into the national reserves, which are managed by sovereign wealth funds, GIC and Temasek. These are among the largest and most powerful investment vehicles in the world. So when the government underprojects its surplus by billions, that money quietly flows into investment vehicles that operate with very limited public transparency. The Singaporean public essentially overtaxed itself to fund investment portfolios they have minimal oversight of.
The tough decisions to raise taxes earlier that Wong references include the GST hike. Singapore's goods and services tax was raised from 7 to 9% in 2 stages. That tax increase was justified to the public as necessary for fiscal sustainability. But if the government was already on track for a massive surplus, the urgency of that tax increase looks very different in retrospect. Were citizens asked to shoulder a higher tax burden based on projections the government knew or should have known were overly pessimistic?
And here's the broader pattern, Maya. This isn't unique to Singapore. Governments around the world routinely underproject surpluses and overproject deficits because it gives them political cover to maintain higher tax rates and spending restraint. It's a form of fiscal gaslighting, telling citizens the cupboard is bare when it's actually overflowing. The difference is that most governments don't end up with a surplus this dramatically larger than projected. A $12 billion miss is not a rounding error. That's a policy choice masquerading as a forecasting problem.
The question for Singaporeans is straightforward. If the government has $12 billion more than it expected, who decides how that money is used, and what democratic input do citizens have in that decision? In a more transparent system, a windfall of this magnitude would trigger a genuine public debate about tax cuts, increased social spending, or infrastructure investment. In Singapore's system, it largely flows into reserves with minimal public deliberation. That's not fiscal prudence, it's fiscal concentration of power.
Now let's shift gears to something that might seem lighter but actually raises profound questions about scientific discovery and knowledge. Researchers have found that the physics of earthquakes and lightning can help explain why your sneakers squeak on a gym floor. And before you think we've gone soft, stay with me on this one.
According to Nature, high-speed footage has revealed that shoe squeaks can actually begin with a tiny bolt of lightning, a triboelectric discharge, to be precise. This is the same fundamental physics that governs earthquakes and lightning strikes. Researchers used ultra-high-speed cameras to capture what happens at the microscopic level when rubber meets a smooth floor, and they found stick-slip dynamics remarkably similar to seismic fault mechanics, complete with miniature electrical discharges.
Now, here's why this matters beyond being a quirky science story. This research demonstrates something we at Truth Report think about a lot: the universe operates on fundamental patterns that repeat across vastly different scales. The same physics that causes catastrophic earthquakes killing thousands also makes your sneakers squeak in a quiet library. The same electrical principles behind a devastating lightning strike are at play beneath your feet every time you pivot on a basketball court. This is a reminder that understanding the small can illuminate the catastrophically large, and vice versa.
And there's a second finding bundled into this research that's genuinely significant. The same team found evidence that a debated brain phenomenon actually exists in humans. This is the kind of basic science that doesn't make headlines because there's no immediate commercial application, but it's the foundation on which everything else is built. Understanding the fundamental physics of friction, discharge, and wave propagation has implications for earthquake prediction, material science, and yes, even neuroscience.
What frustrates me as a journalist is how this kind of pure research is consistently underfunded compared to applied research with immediate commercial potential. The scientists doing this work aren't developing the next smartphone app or pharmaceutical product. They're trying to understand fundamental physical processes. And yet, these fundamental discoveries often lead to the most transformative applications decades later. We systematically undervalue this work because our funding structures are biased toward short-term returns.
And let's talk about access. This research was published in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, and one that operates behind a paywall. The public, whose tax dollars often fund this research through government grants, frequently cannot access the findings without paying substantial subscription fees. We're in an era where scientific literacy is more important than ever, and we've built a system where the most important scientific knowledge is locked behind paywalls that primarily benefit publishing conglomerates. That is a structural failure that doesn't get nearly enough scrutiny.
The connection between understanding squeaky shoes and understanding earthquakes is also a perfect example of why we can't let policymakers decide which research is useful and which isn't. If you'd asked a legislator to fund a study on sneaker squeaks, they'd laugh you out of the room. But that study reveals fundamental dynamics relevant to earthquake science, materials engineering, and neuroscience. The history of science is full of seemingly trivial investigations that produced world-changing insights. Curiosity-driven research is not a luxury, it's the engine of human progress.
Now let's move to our final story, and it's one with enormous implications. Researchers have identified how an enzyme activated by exercise helps keep the brain young by reinforcing the blood-brain barrier. Alex, this is genuinely groundbreaking.
It absolutely is, Maya. According to Nature's reporting, scientists have discovered that a specific protein, activated through physical exercise, works to reinforce the blood-brain barrier, that critical membrane that protects the brain from harmful substances in the bloodstream. As we age, this barrier becomes increasingly leaky, allowing inflammatory molecules and pathogens to reach brain tissue. This research identifies a specific molecular mechanism by which exercise combats that deterioration.
Let me break down why this matters so much. The blood-brain barrier is one of the most important protective structures in the human body. When it deteriorates, it's associated with neurodegenerative diseases including Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. The fact that exercise activates a specific enzyme that reinforces this barrier gives us a molecular target, meaning this isn't just about telling people to jog more. This opens the door to pharmaceutical interventions that could mimic or enhance this protective mechanism.
And this is where the story becomes an investigative one, because the question is, who will control access to those interventions? If this research leads to a drug that reinforces the blood-brain barrier and slows cognitive aging, that drug will be worth billions. Potentially tens of billions. The pharmaceutical industry is already positioning itself around anti-aging and longevity science, and the people who can least afford these interventions, the elderly poor, people in developing nations, communities without adequate healthcare infrastructure, will be the last to benefit.
There's a profound equity dimension here. Right now, today, the finding tells us that exercise protects the brain. Exercise is free. But we know that the ability to exercise regularly is not equally distributed. People working multiple low-wage jobs, people in communities without safe spaces for physical activity, people with disabilities, they don't have equal access to even this free intervention. When you add the likelihood of expensive pharmaceutical equivalents, you're looking at a future where cognitive health becomes yet another marker of economic privilege.
Let's also talk about the research funding pipeline. Studies like this typically receive funding from a combination of government grants, university endowments, and increasingly, private investment. As the commercial potential of longevity and anti-aging research becomes clear, private money is flowing in, but private money comes with strings. It comes with patent expectations, with exclusive licensing agreements, with the understanding that discoveries will be monetized for maximum return, not distributed for maximum human benefit.
And this connects directly to our Hong Kong story, doesn't it? Those university bonds we discussed at the top of the show, the ones backed by government guarantees, will fund the institutions where this kind of research happens. The financial architecture of higher education directly shapes what gets studied, who funds it, and who profits from it. When universities are issuing bonds and answering to bondholders, the pressure to produce commercially viable research intensifies. Curiosity-driven basic science, the kind that discovered how sneaker squeaks relate to earthquakes, gets squeezed out in favor of research with clear monetization pathways.
That's a brilliant connection, Maya, and it brings us to our synthesis. Because when you lay these 5 stories side by side, a clear pattern emerges. In every case, we're looking at systems of power and money shaping who benefits from public resources and public knowledge.
In Hong Kong, it's the financial engineering of education, using bonds and government backing to build megacampuses where the risks are socialized and the benefits are concentrated among developers, institutions, and political interests. The public pays, the powerful profit, and academic freedom becomes another casualty of financial entanglement with the state.
With the Clintons and Epstein, it's the accountability gap, the decades-long pattern of powerful people being insulated from consequences by the very systems that are supposed to deliver justice. Testimony is happening, which is progress, but the fundamental question remains whether any system can hold its most powerful participants accountable, or whether the appearance of accountability is itself a tool for managing public anger without delivering actual justice.
In Singapore, it's fiscal opacity dressed up as fiscal prudence. A government collects $12 billion more than it said it would, and frames this as responsible management rather than what it actually is, a failure of transparent governance and democratic input over public resources. The surplus flows into investment vehicles with minimal public oversight, concentrating financial power further.
And in the science stories, it's the tension between knowledge as a public good and knowledge as a commodity. We have researchers uncovering fundamental truths about the physical world and the human body, and at every stage, funding, publication, application, there are gatekeepers extracting value and restricting access. The physics of sneaker squeaks could illuminate earthquake prediction, but only if the research ecosystem supports that kind of cross-disciplinary, curiosity-driven work. Exercise protects the aging brain, but turning that knowledge into equitable health outcomes requires political will that doesn't currently exist.
The thread that connects all 5 stories is this: in every case, the systems that are supposed to serve the public interest have been captured or distorted by concentrated power. Financial systems that should transparently fund public goods instead create opaque debt structures. Justice systems that should hold everyone equally accountable instead move at different speeds depending on how much power you hold. Fiscal systems that should honestly represent a government's financial position instead become tools for consolidating resources. And knowledge systems that should freely disseminate discoveries instead lock them behind paywalls and patent portfolios.
And here's what we want you, our viewers, to understand. These are not separate problems requiring separate solutions. They are all manifestations of the same structural dynamic, the tendency of institutions, over time, to serve the interests of their most powerful stakeholders rather than the public they were created to serve. Whether it's a university issuing bonds in Hong Kong, a former president testifying about Epstein, a government in Singapore sitting on a hidden surplus, or a pharmaceutical company preparing to monetize brain barrier research, the pattern is identical.
The antidote is the same in every case too: transparency, accountability, and an informed public that demands both. That's why we do this show. Not to tell you what to think, but to show you the connections that power would prefer you didn't see. When you understand that the financial engineering of education, the slow walking of elite accountability, the manipulation of fiscal projections, and the commodification of scientific knowledge are all part of the same system, you're no longer looking at isolated news stories. You're seeing the architecture of power itself.
So here's your call to action tonight. Ask your representatives who bears the risk when governments back institutional bonds. Demand that Epstein-related testimony and documents be made fully public, regardless of which political figures are implicated. Question why budget surpluses of this magnitude are treated as pleasant surprises rather than evidence of systematic overtaxation. And advocate for open access scientific publishing so that publicly funded research is available to the public that funded it.
The powerful count on your attention being fragmented. They count on you seeing each story in isolation. They count on you being overwhelmed and tuning out. Don't give them that satisfaction. Connect the dots. Follow the money. Demand answers. And share what you learn.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. We've reported from sources including the South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera, and Nature. Every claim we've made tonight is grounded in verified reporting, and we encourage you to read the original sources yourself. The truth doesn't need us to protect it, it just needs people willing to speak it.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Remember, the most dangerous thing to concentrated power isn't opposition, it's an informed public that can see the whole board. We'll be here every night doing exactly that. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay connected. This has been Truth Report. Good night.